Sometimes motorcycle companies have subtle, interesting, nuanced ways of selling nostalgia to the motorcyclist. Think of the original MV Agusta Brutale and compare it to the modern iterations. And sometimes they just pull a legendary motorcycle name out of their back pocket and slap it on something that has nothing to do with that motorcycle. Well, those are the motorcycles we're going to look at today. That's not entirely true for every motorcycle on this list. Often these bikes do share at least, the spirit of their originals, or maybe they've been evolving and changing so much that if you traveled back in time and showed the modern bike to the company when they were releasing the original, they would have no clue what it is. So we got some different stuff today, but regardless, we're looking at 8 motorcycles that are basically nothing like their original. First, we have the Yamaha R7, a great little bike. And guys, don't think I'm saying that these are all bad bikes, or that the R7's a bad bike, because it's not. See, the R7 is an iconic, groundbreaking, performance-oriented, race-homologated motorcycle, a literal race bike for sale to only the most exclusive buyers. The R7 of today is a naked street bike tuned for the street. Not even really tuned for the track. Well, okay, it is tuned for the track more, but it's based on a platform that was tuned for the street, not a bike that was made for the street, and they slapped a fairing on it. That doesn't mean it isn't cool, that doesn't mean it isn't a great bike, because it is, according to most people. And it doesn't mean you can't use it for racing, because it can be used for at least some forms of racing in certain classes. But the new R7 really is nothing. It shares nothing with the original R7. It is an R7 in name only, and that's okay. Now, this is a motorcycle that's awesome, yes, for sure, but it was definitely Triumph pulling out a name that would have some oomph, some force. A legendary, innovative motorcycle, something that the new Trident really isn't. We're talking, of course, about the Triumph Trident. Again, it's great, don't hear me wrong about this, but listen, it's got very little to do with the original bike, and it's not like some groundbreaking new motorcycle the way the original Trident was. The original Trident was Triumph's first attempt at a 3-cylinder engine. The real successor to the original Trident would be, of course, the Speed Triple and that whole line. And of course, this motorcycle fits in the lineage of 3-cylinder engines, as it's a rework of the Daytona 675 platform, but in terms of styling, it's really taken nothing from that original motorcycle. It looks nothing like it. It's just a 3-cylinder engine, so hence the name Trident fits. That's pretty much it. It's a cool bike, not really like the original. Next up, we have the Honda CB500F. Now, Honda's letter designations are really the problem here. For Honda, the letter F originally meant 4, with the Honda CB750 and 500 and 550 and 450 and 350, F. These were all 4-cylinder motorcycles that really made Honda what it is today. These are iconic, performance-oriented, legendary bikes that were groundbreaking in terms of technology and reliability. These were world beaters, seriously. These bikes took down entire industries, namely the British motorcycle industry. The original Honda CB500F was a baby brother to the CB750, but in terms of performance, it was almost as fast. This bike could do the quarter mile in pretty much the same time, just a little bit less. Today, the Honda CB500F is really just distinguished from their 500cc sport bike, the CB500R. These are not interesting motorcycles. They're pretty soulless, uninteresting bikes. They're not performance oriented. They're not even 4 cylinders. These have nothing to do with the original bikes. And I don't know that Honda means for them to. I think they're just using these letters. Back in the day, though, the CB500F was the best motorcycle that money could buy, or one of the best motorcycles money could buy. Not so much today. All right, now this one falls under the category of evolved. Sure, the original Honda Goldwing is completely different than the modern one. It looks nothing like it. But that's because that was an ever-evolving platform, so I don't fault them at all for this. The Goldwing is really the standard tourer, and touring is something that has just changed so much since the 70s and even since the 90s. Nevertheless, the current Goldwing is bigger, heavier, and uglier. It's currently powered by a 6-cylinder engine, which started in the 80s actually, whereas the original Goldwing was an inline 4 from the 70s. Regardless, the spirit is there. It's big, it's heavy, it's reliable, capable of high speed, endless miles, and big and heavy and big. Yes, these are big old honking heavy bikes. But yeah, the new Goldwing doesn't look anything like the original. And mechanically speaking, it shares very little except for a shaft drive, I would say. There's some other things, but the new Goldwing is certainly the successor to the Goldwings of the 80s and 90s, but very little to do with the originals. All right, let's pick on Triumph again, and let's do this by simply showing you these two motorcycles. One of the original Triumph trophies, or the original trophy from the 50s and 60s, and this god-awful thing. I'm going to say this is probably the worst one on the list. It's one of the worst ones. The original Triumph trophy was essentially a designation for a scrambler, or like a sort of off-road oriented bike from their lineup. The bikes you could just jump on and take to the pub, and then maybe, go race your friend, like drag race or something. And then you could also go out onto, some back roads or take it out into the sticks for the weekend. The trophy was essentially a scrambler, and originally it actually predated the Bonneville in both style and performance. It's the real predecessor and arguably more influential motorcycle in terms of style, and this was the real predecessor and arguably a more influential motorcycle than the Bonneville. This was the Trophy 650, the TR6, whatever you want to call it. This is the bike that Steve McQueen rode that literally took him from being like a 9.7 in coolness to like an 11.4 or so. And then there's this bike, the Triumph Trophy, released by Triumph when they brought the company back in the 90s and revived it. It's a touring bike. It's actually a great bike from what I've heard. It does run and it rolls some stuff, but that's about as much as it has in common with the original trophy designation. Now, they pulled this name out, at least in part because it would help sell the bike to old Triumph guys, which I'm sure it probably didn't. But maybe it also just happened because they couldn't think of any other names that would interest people, like, the Triumph Blob or the Triumph Boat. Those names don't ring quite as well. All right, next up we have the Ducati Supersport. The sport bike segment is tough in this regard because these bikes usually do share the DNA of the old bikes. Sure, it did happen with the R7 where they just pulled a name out to apply to a bike. And yeah, the Triumph Daytona isn't really anything like the original Triumph Daytona, but hey, it's the same spirit, so I can't fault them for that. The Ducati Supersport is the same. It's really not that flagrant, but it's a fun one because it really highlights how different sport bikes are in terms of style, especially from the 80s and 90s, but also this first Ducati Supersport from the 70s. This was actually a bike that came out in 1974. It was a 750cc V-twin that produced 73 horsepower, which is a lot of horsepower. This bike set a new standard for sport bike styling. It was essentially a production racer with little effort going into making this a street legal motorcycle. This is an important, some would say the most important Ducati motorcycle in Ducati's history, as it really set a new standard for what could be offered to the public. The current Supersport is basically an affordable Ducati. It's an entry-level Ducati. If there is such a thing as an entry-level Ducati, it produces a little over 100 horsepower, I think like 110. The Supersport of the 70s was basically a Superleggera for its time, whereas the current Supersport from Ducati is a beginner bike. I'm exaggerating, but yeah, it's kind of true. And of course, they look nothing like each other, which is just fine. Nothing from the 70s looks like really anything. Oh wait, never mind. It's the spirit that I think should be there if you're going to use a legendary name like this. One could argue the spirit is there, I guess, in this bike, but not really, in my opinion. Next up, we have the Kawasaki H2, and of course, I'm not going to fault this. This is, in my opinion, a great modern reinvention of the same kind of motorcycle. The original H2 was the fastest thing you could buy in 1972. It was heavy and it was fast. It produced 74 horsepower, which is insane for this time. It was prone to just wheelie all the time. Basically, the engine was way ahead of its own frame. Now, technically speaking, the bike had little in common with the current H2. The original H2 was a 2-stroke, 3-cylinder motorcycle, whereas the current H2 is, of course, an inline 4-stroke with a supercharger. But hey, they're both super fast, they're both heavy, and they're both nutty, so I'm okay with it. All right, last on our list is the one in the thumbnail, the Triumph Tiger. Originally, Tiger was the name used to designate Triumph's new 650cc parallel twin, basically the new big brother to the original 500cc platform dating back to the Speed Twin of 1937. So the Tiger, the Trophy, these names all kind of got interchangeable at some point. But Tiger would go on to mean a lot of different things. Notably, it kind of ended up meaning the same thing as the Trophy that was mentioned before, though it was often applied to the smaller bikes like the 350 and even the Mountain Cub and the 500cc. Like my bike is technically a Tiger, They were essentially scramblers, which is why I always thought it would be cool if Triumph would have called their scrambler lineup Tigers or Trophies. But Triumph decided to use Tiger to delineate their adventure bike lineup, which again, I have no problem with. You can take them on the street, and I guess if you like plodding, incredibly heavy motorcycles onto off-road situations, you can take them off-road. I'd probably rather take an old Tiger off-road though, honestly, because they were essentially dirt bikes, they're like 350 pounds. But that's beside the point. The difficult part for me is the styling. The current Bonnevilles are at least styled after the classic Triumphs. The Tigers aren't even trying. It's just literally a name. And you guys probably know how I feel about adventure bikes in general if you've watched my channel much. I just find them to be ugly and soulless and, I don't know, just thoroughly uninteresting to me. And I'm a dad, guys, so I guess I'm supposed to like these bikes. Maybe I will in like 30 years, I don't know. But as an owner, technically, of a Tiger, okay, I have the right to be offended. I take this somewhat personal. And yeah, I left it for number 1 because it's just so drastic and because it looks good in the thumbnail. Anyways, let me know what you guys think. Are you cool with companies digging up old motorcycle names for their bikes to try to sell them to you? Do you own a Tiger? Maybe you want to vehemently defend it in the comments. Go for it. Anyways, much love, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.